Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We're back taking our first look at 21st Century Boys, the final installment, Naoki Urasawa's magnum opus. I really consider this to be the best of his work, although I have to admit I haven't read everything he's done. Of what I have read, and especially of what I've read that attempts to be a tight, well written suspense story, I think this is my favorite. I think Monster probably sticks its ending a little bit better, but we're going to discuss that as time goes on. There will be a segment on where I think this stands overall in his creations later on, but right now, we're just going to look at the first 8 chapters of this, the collected 21st Century Boys uh, signature edition. That's the term for it. Um, there are only 16 chapters in here, which is why we're going to look at 8 chapters now and 8 chapters in our next outing. Excuse me. I consider doing all of this at once, but there's a lot here to unpack, so I'm just going to go through what we've got. 21st Century Boys, as I've mentioned in my previous videos on this series, is a continuation of the story, but not a direct one. That is to say, the first chapter of this did not publish immediately after the final chapter of 20th Century Boys. And I've done a lot of research, and I can't be 100% certain of why that is. I've read a lot of conflicting information, and truth be told, not all of the official English language information on this series has been proven correct. In fact, the author has contradicted at least one thing that we were told about it when it was originally published. So I don't know exactly what's going on here. I'm going to do my best to just treat the story as the story. But if you're curious, there was something like a 4 to 6 month gap between the publishing of the final chapter of 20th Century Boys and the first chapter of 21st Century Boys. It does read like a direct sequel, so I'm not sure why that might be. Speculation is kind of pointless at this juncture, I think, until there is some more English language commentary on it. I'm not going to go too far out of my way to try and speculate on that. Although I forgot to check the translator notes. Let's see if they say anything about it here. I don't see anything. This is all about sound effects. And, okay, yeah, so there's nothing in here that's relevant to that. What happens in the story, which is the more important question, in my opinion? Well, we pick up with the last 10 pages or so of 20th Century Boys, just told slightly differently. And this is kind of a catch-up section. If you had read the previous chapter but kind of forgotten it in the 4 months between the publishing of this and the publishing of the previous chapter, this will kind of help you remember where things were left off. There was a big concert at the Expo Park. Kenji refused to play his signature song. The fake friend, or the imposter friend, sent his flying saucers full of virus to attack the concert, but all of the flying saucers were shot down in one way or another. We see all of that recapped for us. We see Kenji coming off the stage at the tail end of the saucer attack, and he pitches in to help clean up the wreckage, which is about what you would expect of someone like Kenji, who has always been pretty in the thick of things when he knew what was going on. And there are some pretty impactful moments right off the bat here. We see Sadakio, who was holding Friend hostage, injured in the crash, and Friend himself actually dies again. Or I should say, the imposter dies this time around. We've already seen the authentic Friend die in 2015. And these are moving moments, and I think they would have had more impact if there had been continuity of story between what we saw at the end of 20th Century Boys and what we see here. Again, I don't know why this decision was made, but it does take a little bit away from this moment. The really interesting thing here is that when Kenji takes off the imposter's mask, the friend's imposter asks Kenji to play his trademark song, which he refused to do on stage. And Kenji does so as a final favor to a dying man. And I'm not going to show it because I've tried to avoid spoiling Friend's identity for the entirety of the series, outside of a couple of key places where it has to be discussed. And I'm gonna maintain that here, but there is this sequence where you see Friend trying to hold his finger up in the trademark symbol of the FDP, but instead he passes and his hand goes limp, and that is a really, really well constructed scene that I thought really conveyed the sense that something, even though Friend and his imposter were terrible influences on the world, this is a part of childhood that has to be moved on. And I think it's a interesting metaphor for the coming of age themes that run all the way through 20th Century Boys. And if you really have to summarize what happened in the previous series in just one scene, that's a pretty good take on it. It's a good summary of the out-of-touch, self-centered elements of childhood passing away in the face of adulthood. It's very poignant, and it serves to set us up for the rest of the story here, because Friend's death is very important, but more as a catalyst to the rest of this story. And that may be why the story was divided like this. It gives us a fresh jumping off point. We have a new world we have to build now. What does the world look like now that Friend is gone and all of his influence is crumbling? What are the characters going to do as they pick up the pieces? And this, as near as I can tell, is the artistic justification for this particular division. If we had 15 chapters without Friend at the end of this story, it would feel awful strange. That said, again, I think this ending would have had more impact if it was part of the core story. Sorry, one of my lights was flickering. I had to make some adjustments to it. Hopefully that holds for the rest of this recording. Anyway, back to what I was saying. After the death of the Friend imposter, we go back to the VR game. And if you recall, that was set up as a storyline to be introduced to us at the end of the previous series. And it's flickering again. I'm sorry. Okay, replace some light bulbs. Hopefully that fixes it. Back to the story. We pick up after the shooting down of the flying saucers, and the pickup point is in the VR game. And again, we saw that in the previous volume. And this is an interesting moment because the VR game is one of the things that upsets me the most about this story. It seems to fly the most in the face of the rules of the world. And as a result, I'm actually going to move all discussion of the VR game to the end of this video. I'm just going to talk about the real-world segments before we dive too deep into that. For the purposes of an analytical summary, I think this works best. In the real world, we see after the shooting down of the saucers, we come back to Karo-yan, who is going through and he's distributing vaccines to the blood virus to help people survive, just in case there's any other caches of this virus the FDP can use to stagger forward. And the story shows Karo-yan reuniting with Kenji, the second person of the core group to do so. I think it's interesting that they chose this order. Maro was always kind of Kenji's closest adult friend and confidant, so I can kind of understand from a storytelling perspective why you would choose Maro as the first person to meet Kenji again. Karo-yan does not have any particularly close connection to Kenji, either as a child or as an adult. So him being second is significant, not so much for the way the time they spent together as characters, but for the ways they grew as characters. Both of them were off the scene for a very long time, and they made decisions they are not proud of. Kenji's return to prominence has followed a different arc than Karayan's return to prominence. But I think this decision was made because emotionally, they are both in kind of the same place. They've brought very good things to bear on the world, but they really feel like they should have been doing these things sooner. After that, we see Kenji find Acho at the foot of the robot that he used to shoot down the flying saucers. There's an emotional reunion there, and there's also an emotional kind of vision, for lack of a better word, where Acho sees his departed son, who has been driving him this whole time. And we had this kind of a moment at the end of 20th Century Boys to put a cap on his character arc. I think Shota's return here is a signifier that we aren't going to get a lot of character development now for Acho, which is fine. I think the journey he went on was more than enough for the character, and I'm fine with having him just be a supporting character going forward. So after that, Kenji meets with the leaders of the UN. The UN arrives in Japan to kind of wrangle things after the collapse of the FDP, and to kind of serve as peacekeepers, which was the UN's original remit, so kind of makes sense here. You can question whether the UN would be coordinated and on top of things enough to show up this quickly, but that's another question. In 20th Century Boys world, when they're not run by evil psychopaths, political organizations tend to work semi-competently most of the time. So I'm okay with being shown it this way. The leader of the UN force informs Kenji that they found an addendum to the New Book of Prophecy, a sheet of paper that says an anti-proton bomb will destroy the world. So here we have, again, another one of these books of prophecy, another childhood game, one played by the imposter this time, rather than by the original friend or Kenji. And this is his little add-on to the story. An afterthought, if you will. And there's some interesting bits here about how some of this may be Urosawa trying to express to the audience why he felt he needed a second antagonist. Again, I'm going to discuss that at the end once Urosawa's laid out his entire case. So I'm going to leave the thematic and structural issues there aside until my final video on the series, where I discuss what I think of all the different characters. So after these reunions and the heads up of the current situation of the greater world, we get a scene where everyone is reunited for the longest time. They're in Yoshitsune's headquarters. They're all eating. They're all laughing. They're all reminiscing. The only people not present, are Sadakiyo, who is in the hospital after his injuries from the falling flying saucer, and Kenji, who seems to be a little ashamed to be around his friends. Sadakiyo is being watched over by Kana in the hospital, and Kana spends a lot of time talking to him, even though he's in no condition to reply. And from this, we learn that Kenji has also been avoiding her. He's not ready to just pick up his life where he left it. And this is interesting because we're really getting an impression that Kenji is in many ways going through an important part of the hero's journey. If you're familiar with Joseph Campbell's hero cycle, there is a part where the hero dies and comes back to life. And for Kenji, that entire process took 18 years. From Bloody New Year's Eve until his return in 2018, Kenji was effectively dead. He was either running from his past, too scared to confront the things he had seen, or he had suffered such traumatic experiences that he could not remember who he was properly. Either way, Kenji has been effectively dead to the world. And now that he's come back, he's brought back the wisdom, and his music, which is his supernatural weapon, if you will, and he has set right the wrongs being spread by the great evil of the Friendship Democratic Party. The problem is when the hero returns home with all the power and gifts that he's been given from his trip through the outer worlds, he fits that old world very poorly. And I think we're seeing Kenji trying to adapt to that. When you add in the fact that Kenji feels like he hasn't been with the people he cares about, he hasn't been serving them with the kind of dedication that we saw Kenji serving his friends and his family at the beginning of the story, we realize that Kenji has an understandable amount of guilt on top of all of that. And I think that's what we're seeing in these scenes. And I'll admit, the first time I read this story way back, 10, 15 years ago, I didn't understand this reaction on Kenji's part. A little older and wiser now, and I think it makes a little more sense to see him separating himself from his friends and family in this way. He's trying to figure out what it means to have gone away and come back and how he should fit into the old dynamics. And that's an interesting examination of what it means to come of age, because this entire story has been defined by leaving behind the molds of childhood that are not suited to who you are now. And Kenji, even though he's in his mid-50s now, still has to experience some of that, because the truth is you never really stop growing up. While all of this is going on, Detective Chono is trying to get into the Tower of the Sun, that weird, bizarre monument thing that was put up in the Expo Plaza. And we finally get in there and we see the answers to some questions. For example, when we saw a friend in there just before his big announcement revealing himself to the world, we saw what looked like children running around in there. And through the magic of manga, which shows us only static images, we realized that what we saw were actually statues of children that friend had left in there. They're very creepy, and they're the sign of an unhealthy mind. But that is what we saw. That is an interesting take on that, and some people may feel like it's a fake out. However, then we get the image of the anti-proton bomb, the weapon that has been hidden in here, that the real world part of this story is building to. And we see that it looks like this. Of course, it has the FDP symbol on it, but, and this is, again, a visual symbol that I didn't pick up on the first time I read this story, it is also a callback to the Taro Taro Bozu Back on the House on Hanging Hill story. And that's a good callback for a couple of reasons. First, it looks like the Taro Taro Bozu. Second, the Taro Taro Bozu was introduced in a VR arc, which we are going through in this part of the story as well. And third, the Taro Taro Bozu arc did a lot of the setup to establish the imposter friend's identity that is going to be revealed here. So that is a good signposting of the story we're about to get. I think it's pretty important, and I didn't catch it the first time. So I think I've said several times, I don't think Urosawa supported his big twist here as well as he could have. I have been reevaluating that a little bit. Again, when I do my video on the characters in this story, I'll talk about it more. For now, that's what happens. This is mixed in with the story of Chono and his uncle. Of course, his uncle, not really his uncle, but that's what they call him. Yamazaki, the police chief. And we get a recap of how Yamazaki murdered his partner in order to pave his way through the FDP cult. We get some insight into him. And we see that Chono has really grown into himself. He is no longer this wet behind the ears cop who is not sure of his place in the world or how he's going to live up to the reputation he wants to carry. Those kind of things they're important. They're important for young people, especially teenagers and young adults finding their place in the world. Chono has found his place in the world now. And ironically, now that he understands that he just has to, rather than worrying about being the unstoppable detective that his grandfather was, he understands that he has to be the man who disassembles the FDP and sees that the crimes of the FDP are prosecuted. And now that he's found his role in society that way, Yamazaki sees his grandfather in him. And indeed, that's fair because Chono is a fully grown adult. He has come of age now. And I think it's impressive to see this coming of age of a character who only entered the story in the second act. And I like it. That's really an impressive bit of storytelling and one that didn't fully sink into me on my first reading of this story. Now, that's everything of import that happens in the real world. We found the anti-proton bomb. We know that we need to disable it in some way. And the final thing that Chono learns is that there's a remote control for it. And Sadakio lets Kana know that he's recorded the place of it and he hid it. But nobody knows exactly where until Sadakio tells her, you have to look in the secret base, which is in the VR game, which nicely brings us back around to that part of the story arc. So we saw Kenji find his younger self in the VR game at the end of 20th Century Boys. And we pick up here with him confronting his younger self and investigating rumors of a ghost by the shrine. There's a lot of elements to this that are interesting character development, but honestly, I think this part of the story moves a little slow. We actually see panels of Kenji meeting his younger self in 3 different chapters. We basically see that scene replayed in its entirety twice and partially once. That's a lot of real estate to devote to this meeting. It is kind of interesting to see Kenji meet his younger self, just like we saw Yoshitsune meet his younger self in the previous VR arc. I just don't think we get a lot of meaningful development from this outside of a little look at how Kenji looks back on himself, which is interesting, but really there's a flashback sequence during the real world arc that is much shorter and more insightful. It revolves around his relationship with Yukiji, and it confirms that they have always kind of had a hot and cold romantic attraction, one that has always been undermined by how prickly they are. And while I think this flashback serves more to remind people of this dynamic, it's been a long time since we've seen it at play, I think this is also a better illumination in fewer pages of Kenji's character than seeing him confront his younger self. Not really a whole lot of interest happens there. But after that, we discover the identity of the ghost at the shrine. It's Manjome. And if you remember, Manjome was killed while he was in the VR game. So apparently the VR game has just hoovered up his consciousness and it's still knocking around there. And it is through discussions with Manjome that Kenji learns pretty much the same things that we learned from the real world part of this story arc. I think the interactions with Manjome are important, and Manjome introduces the idea that it is not the original thing that is big, nor is it a copy of the original thing that's big. It's the copy of the copy that gets big. And that is kind of the idea that underpins Friend's imposter. Friend was copying Kenji, the imposter was copying Friend, and the imposter was the one who went for broke. That's an interesting idea, and it's going to be a thematic line that we explore a little bit more later on. But given that so much of the VR arc is copying or duplicating, not copying, but duplicating revelations that we got from the real world arc, it feels kind of extraneous. I don't really feel like Kenji needed to go back in the game as early as he did. It is necessary later on, so I'll admit that. But I don't think he needed to go in the game as early as he did and waste so much real estate when we could have just been pushing the real world stuff forward and getting some more of that nuanced character work with real impactful characters in the real world. On top of that, as I said before, Manjome's consciousness or soul or whatever is stuck in the VR game. Again, I don't really understand whether this is a supernatural story or not, or what we're looking at, or if the simulation just copied all of Manjome's habits and those are what is actually propagating in the VR game. I mean, we know so little about how that technology works in the first place. All of it is really strange and bizarre and feels out of step with the rest of the world that's been built. Especially because Kana admits when she's talking with Sadakio that she feels kind of like after her uncle came back and all of her expectations for the future were subverted, she feels like she never had any powers to begin with. So, at the same time, on one hand, the story is questioning whether there's any supernatural elements to this. On the other hand, we have Manjome's ghost in the VR program, and the VR program is showing us that friend and his imposter were predicting the future and the past. It's very confusing from a world building point of view. Now, I can say that other stories based in the 20th century world that Urosawa has done has confirmed that there is an element of the supernatural to this world. But it's certainly not 100% clear from what this story is telling us. And I really wish it would have been a little more direct with that. I know he's probably going for a magical realism vibe to keep us guessing, but at some point it just becomes confusing rather than pleasingly mysterious. Just my thoughts on that particular aspect. Anyway, I think this is an okay addition to the 20th Century Boys story. There are some very strong emotional moments in here, but I do think that for the most part, having the VR storyline running parallel to the real world storyline is extraneous. And for the most part, I would have just liked to see what I got here condensed into about 3 chapters and tacked on to the end of 20th Century Boys. And my feelings about the second half are not quite as harsh, but in a similar vein. I'll give you those at another time, however. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.